Hello, and welcome to another FHIR for Developers tutorial video. My name is Gino Canessa, and today we're going to continue on our quest through some of the server-side FHIR things, particularly hoping to get to looking at different database modeling decisions we can make and how they affect everything going up the chain. But today's video will focus on getting the API project up and running. I'll note before we get into it that there are a lot of facade server components, some open source, some commercial, closed source, the whole gamut. This is a common thing that people do, so there are a lot of pieces out there that can do that for you. However, we're trying to learn here, and so it's useful to build everything up, and that way we can see really how our decisions affect things. So with that, let's jump right in. I'm starting here at just kind of the default repo that I have, just git, ignore, readme, all that kind of stuff. So I'm even going to have to make my source directory, and we haven't actually created all the projects and everything in a little bit, so I will go ahead and do that here. As usual, if you do a .NET, well, what is it, list SDKs first, you can see what versions of .NET you have installed. In this case, I have the one I'm going to be using is 60201, so I don't even know if that's the latest or not, but that's what I have. You can also do .NET new -L, and that will show you all of the templates you have installed. I happen to have a lot of them because I have all of this MAUI, cross-platform UI, Android, iOS, Mac OS, all these different things on here that you may or may not have. But you will have the one we want today, which is just a pretty straightforward web API. Before we create it, something I don't think I've actually talked through here before is if you do something like web API and ask for help, you can see that the templates have different parameters. If you use the Visual Studio instead of Visual Studio Code, you'll notice that when you create a new project, it often asks you some of these details like what kind of authentication do you want? Do you want HTTPS or not? Different things like that. The command line can do all of those things. We can pass them as parameters, and I think there's even an interactive mode, but I don't use that. If I'm going to do interactive, I'll just use the UI. So in this case, we can see that there are a lot of different options that are available for the web API and just kind of configuring the things by default. So we'll use a few of them. So here we're just going to do .NET new. We're going to create a web API. We'll give it a name, and we'll just call it FHIR CS Databases. We're already in our source directory, so we just want to output to the local directory. I'm going to turn off authentication and no HTTPS. I'm going to turn off authentication and HTTPS. First, because we're doing development and we're not worried about production things, and authentication and HTTPS kind of get in the way. They're annoying for these things. But also because it's a pretty valid architecture, and a lot of systems these days are configured so that, for instance, your HTTPS certificates and everything are at the edge, and then those communicate and proxy everything into plain servers running HTTP, so you don't have certificate management on the same systems that you have your actual code running, or if you're running in containers and don't want to deal with setting those up and redeploying every time your certs change, things like that. Authentication, same thing. Generally, you're going to want to add authentication to a FHIR server, but here we're just learning about our modeling decisions, and we're not going to worry about it. So once we have that created, we can see we have our project ready to go. Before I actually open VS Code, though, I'm going to pull up NuGet here, and we know that we're using FHIR, so we're going to use the FHIRnet SDK. There's all the readmes and all these things. In this case, I'm using the 4.0 beta, and that is just because 4.0 is going to be released soon. This has been pretty stable, has a lot of improvements from the 3 series. So I've been using it, and this is not for production. That said, everything we do should work fine in whichever version you're using. It's just a matter of there might be little discrepancies in some of the syntax or things like that. But There's new serializers and parsers and things like that that are very nice in the new ones. Kudos for all of the work on those, on everything in there. But we'll go ahead and just copy that command and add the package so that we have it. And then we'll bring up VS Code. And we can see that we have what looks like a project. It looks pretty valid to me. So we're going to hit F5, and we can see that we have some options here. We can do .NET 5 and .NET Core, or the other ones, we'll just do .NET 5 and .NET Core, and we can add all of the missing things, but we don't need to worry about Python. That just changed, and I haven't updated my VS Code yet. So now when we hit F5, we can see it's going through its build steps. It did add a launch JSON and a task JSON, so that's all good. And we can see that it started everything up. We can also see it launched a web page that is getting a 404. And that is because even though we have Swagger and all the Open API discovery and everything churned on, it's not actually at the root. If you look at where the Swagger things are hosted, they're actually hosted at /swagger/index.html. And we could just change our web page there, but we can also change it here. And I like that better. So we'll go ahead and just say only if we're in the development environment, then we want to add a map get. And we'll just take the default route and instead return a redirect to Swagger index.html. Perfect. And now when we run, in theory, there we go. Now it routes us directly to Swagger index.html, which is a much more usable thing than this. We could also go and change the launch and all those different things to do it, but I don't plan on adding anything that would be at the root, and so this is going to be straightforward for this. In this case, you can see that we added the thing we added at the root, and it's just saying that it's going to forward us. And then there's the weather forecast, which if you've been using .NET recently, you are likely familiar with. Perfect. So we have a web API, and we have our controller, which is our weather forecast controller. We're going to want a FHIR controller, since that's what we're trying to do. We'll start by copying things from the forecast controller. Obviously, we could just rename them or things like that, but this works for me. And we'll just leave the rest. So right now, this is just going to be a duplicate. It's just changing that we're in FHIR, and we'll delete the weather controller things in a minute. I want to call attention to here, in case you're not familiar with how the web APIs work in .NET 6. You can see that our route has this bracket controller syntax. And what that's doing is pulling the name of the controller from the class, removing that controller at the end. So you can see when we were looking in Swagger, you can see that the controller the route is at /weather forecast, even though it was called weather forecast controller. So our FHIR controller is going to be mapped to the route /FHIR, which works out well because that's pretty typical for what we want. And for now, we can we'll actually just delete most of this. Yeah, we'll just delete all of it. So all we have left here is our constructor, which is injecting a logger, and go from there. So the next thing I want to do before we get back to it here is kind of look at what we're going to try and implement. So this is the HTTP page on FHIR, on the FHIR specification, and we can see that this is just going to cover what all of the HTTP calls look like and what's the shape of the API. There is going to be a bridge we have to a gap we have to bridge here. And that's to say that in the API we're designing, we have routes, and then we have the HTTP verbs. We have get, put, post, delete. When we look at FHIR, we have what are called interactions, and that's what's used instead of the HTTP verbs. So you can see, for instance, there's read. Read maps to a get in this shape. So it's saying we have a base URL, which is just the root URL of the server. We don't care about that. Then it has a type, which is the FHIR resource, and then an ID. So if we're using the verb get in this form, then that's supposed to be a read. Conversely, we can see there's a vRead, which takes that same syntax, adds this history, and then a version ID. And so you can see these are both part of get. It gets a little more complicated on things like search. You can see here there's get and post-based search. And so it's not going to be as straightforward as just saying, here's a get, here's a post, here's a put, here's a delete, because we need to map these things between them. So what can that look like in practice? Well, let's see. Let's say we want to do a public and we're going to do an action result. So we have something to return, and we'll just do some of these things. So we'll say instance read. We'll try this method first. We don't know what it's going to take, and we don't know what it's going to do. Beyond, we can just say something like return a not found result. So that way it's a valid function that'll compile and everything, but it's just always going to return not found. Right now it's not mapped to anything. We just have this function defined inside our controller, and we do need to annotate it to figure out what it's going to do. So the first thing we can do is say based on which verb we're using. So in this case, we're saying this is a get. And right now, this route, if we're looking, this is going to be equivalent to /FHIR. I'll put this in a comment. So right now, this controller is going to be /FHIR. So now we want something that has the type or the resource name. So this is actually here. Let me do this. So we have base. Then we had type, and then we had ID. So in our case, the controller takes care of this FHIR. The type, we want to actually define on a whole bunch of things, right? We might want to support patient and encounter and et cetera, et cetera. What we can actually do here is just add to our route using the curly braces instead of the square brackets. And here we can do something like resource name. And this will just grab whatever is in this section of the URL, if it matches this route, and give it to us as a parameter that we'll annotate here in a second, because we can do the same thing with the ID. We can actually pass a name of a function here. And so this is, we call it instance read, and it's probably useful to actually rename our actual function to something like get type ID. So here in our parameters, we can start adding resource name and string ID. However, we want to tell it that it's picking these up from the route. And so that is just another annotation here that we say grab these values from the route and populate them as parameters into our function. Which is nice because now it's just going to say whatever someone enters here will show up in our function, and we can just use resource name, which is a string, and we know it's something because it's passed in as part of the route. We have a couple more things we need to annotate here. One of them is the produces, and there's a couple of different ways we could do this. We can annotate it at different levels. If we know that everything in the controller is going to produce the same thing, we could put it there. I like to annotate each function just in case something's returning a file or different things like that are there. In our case, I prefer JSON to XML, and so I'm going to just say for our simplified version, we're just going to return JSON. If we wanted to, we can add the produces attribute is odd. The first one, they know that you just might want a single type. If you want additional ones, then you pass a string. So you can always do something like this if you wanted to add that it might return FHIR plus XML. That's what it would look like if you wanted to return both. But again, in our case, let's keep things a little bit simple for ourselves. The other annotation I like to do is this produces response type. And what that is that we can say this might return a 404 not found. We can also say things like it might return a status 200 OK. And I think those are probably the only two that we really want from here. We might add something like status 500 internal server error if we want to catch things separately from not found. Obviously, if you're adding authorization and things like that, this can get a little bit verbose, but this gives a lot of good hinting to the Swagger UI, and it's good. I like it as a developer kind of commenting to say these are the things that I want to be returning. So since it's not implemented, we'll just say not found instead of throwing or anything like that. So that's how we do something like a read. We can go through and do some of these other functions. We can do things like public action result. We'll try and do some of the simpler ones first. Say something like delete type ID. And actually, that one is going to be almost identical. So we'll just copy it because instead of an HTTP get, this is an HTTP delete. And then this is instance delete because that's the only thing you can do here, and we don't have to worry about it. So we have read, we have delete, we really need some creates. So let's start sketching out what that looks like. We can do an action result, and we first have the option of post type. And this, and again, I'm going to jump back and forth between the documentation here. I encourage you to do the same, but on the screen it's a little hard to read if I have both up at the same time on the video recording. So when we look at create, we can see that there is a type level interaction for create, and then there's actually this instance level update that has a note here saying or create if it's new. And so we could do a put base type ID, which is update or create, and then we have a type level create, which is just post base type. And again, we're going to do relatively simple versions of these things, but we do want to have some functionality as well. So first, we can say if we're posting to the type, we know that we just have the resource name, and we can call this type create. We might return a status 201 created. That sounds reasonable. We really shouldn't be returning an OK. And then we have server error, and that seems like a reasonable place to start. I'll note that these are listed in the documentation. So when we talk about like create, you can see there's a 201 created and that you fill out the header, and then you can do a bad request or unprocessable or things like that. So yeah, we can add the bad request. Oops, let's add it instead of just replacing it. And 400 is bad request. And we'll actually add that to a couple of these because it is possible for things like this. Well, we know this segment has to exist. If someone passes in a URL like this and just has a bunch of segments, it might route to us, and we want to throw that out as a bad request. So what does this mean? Well, for now, we're going to return bad requests because we don't care. We're not implementing these yet. We're just sketching out what they look like. So this is a type create, and that's post type. And you can see I'm naming the functions. What'll be helpful for me internally to be able to say, well, this function is post type, but I want to know that it's also the type create as far as FHIR is concerned. So In fact, why don't we just stop there before we define more and take a look at what we have. So when we run this, it's going to go ahead and launch our Swagger UI. And we can see that there's this root thing, there's weather forecast because we haven't deleted it yet, and then there's FHIR. And we can see that we have FHIR resource name ID, which takes in a resource name and an ID. And we can have the responses we enumerated, so we can see there's success, there's bad request, there's not found, all of these types of things. And we can see this is true for delete, and we can see that this is true for post on the type. So here you're seeing that we can fill out, if we say try it out, we can add, patient, and when we execute, we're going to get a response of bad request because that's the only thing we return right now. But it's good to see that that is working. So if we stop our project so that we can get back to work here, I think we're far enough along that we're comfortable deleting weather forecast controller and this weather forecast.cs. There, so we'll clean up our project a little bit. So the other type of create we wanted to talk about was a put instance. And the trick here is that there's two things that could happen. So this isn't just type create, this is instance update or create. And so this is useful for, again, essentially just a comment telling us that if you're putting an instance, we might be updating something existing, or we might be asking to create a new one. Whether we're actually going to support all that functionality or not, we can decide on later, but for now we want the option. And we forgot to put our resource name in post type, and we need resource name and ID from put, and we need to change it to a put. So you can see we're building this out. It's actually not too, doesn't take all too long. I don't remember on the update, and so this is where it's helpful to just come and look at all of these. And if we do update, we can see 200 OK, 201 created, and then all the 400s, 500s. So we can just add status 200 OK. And then here we're just going to return bad request. We'll change all these later, obviously. So what else are we missing? We probably want some search. I don't know that we're going to need to deal with, well, I can say I don't plan to deal, at least in V1, with patch or history or some of these things. We will want capabilities, if for nothing else than for us to keep track of. And then we're going to want search. And I think that will be, we might want batch transaction on the whole system, but we'll deal with that. So for search, we have two things. We have a get-based search and a post-based search that we need to take care of. So the get-based search, we can actually grab from our get type ID. Oh, and we've mixed our names here. Get type ID, get delete type ID, post type, and this should be put type ID because we have the instance names up here, not down here. So same thing here. We want to say if we do a get on the type, that is a type search. And that route, again, is just the HTTP GET on the resource name. Not found isn't a sensical thing. OK, bad request, and internal server error are. And so we'll change these back to bad request. Everything's a bad request if we don't support it. So that handles get-based search. If we want to handle post-based search, we have a little bit, again, one of those routing challenges. If we want to grab an action result of post type ID operation. So here's the trick. We have, and we can split this out in a few different ways, but I think this is going to be simple for what we're going to support. When we say base type search, this underscore search is really taking the place. There's other things that could be here. There could be an ID, right? Because we can't really tell the difference, and different things like that. So we'll actually just take post type search, and we will try and add this, and we'll see what happens. When we say resource name underscore search, and this should be, yep, this is type get type search, we'll say. Oh no, this was going to be our post, right? Because we already have our type search there. So this is a get type search, and this is a post type search. Get type search and post type search. And same thing, we'll just put bad request for right now. So when we try and run this, I'm guessing we're going to get an error. Let's see if it can figure out the routing for us. Oh no, it did figure out the routing for us. Perfect. So, because we don't have a post that has the anything else yet. Okay, so we'll deal with that quirk later. The issue is going to be differentiating between when you have something like an ID or when you have something like search. But we haven't added support for operations yet, which is when you add post ID and an operation. And then we need to discriminate between all of them and tell the order that they're routing and things like that. Again, right now, we don't care, but the ordering in the file is what we can use to control that because they're added in order. So, for now, though, we aren't going to worry about operations because we're building a simple server. And again, going back to this is why when you're doing this, that you want full support for everything, you generally are going to want a FSAID server, or you're going to, obviously, there's I don't want to discourage anyone from taking the time to do all of this and build everything out that way. I will fix this just because then we don't have to deal with it later. But this, really, we want operation. Something like that. Well, we'll just leave it search for now. Again, we don't want to over-engineer for what we're trying to be able to see. So, actually, let's look here. Is that enough of an API to get moving on with? We can read a resource, we can delete a resource, we can put or post a resource to create one. In theory, we can put to update it. We can search based on the type with a get, or search based on a post. If we come here and look at our operations, the only other one we really need are capabilities and batch transaction. So capabilities, we can see we have a special get at the base / metadata. So we have a couple options. First is we already have a get that takes a resource name, and that's here. And this is where I was saying we need to disambiguate some of these things. If we want to do get metadata as a separate function with a separate route, we just need to make sure it comes before any of these other ones that could be routed the same. So get type ID would be a problem, and so we need to put it here. And so now we can say something like get metadata, and we can just put metadata here as the route, and get metadata, which in this case they're going to be the same. If we wanted to, we could go instead down to where we have the conflict, which would be the get type search is the one that's going to that would be crossed. And we could just add the filtering here, so we could say this could be get type search or metadata, and that would work just as well. But we can put the route here explicitly saying this is on the metadata, and really the only options we have are OK in this case, because metadata should always work, but we no longer have any of these parameters. And you can see when we run this now, and if we move this window back here, we can see we have this FHIR metadata that's before any of the other ones because they're put in order. And if we try it out and execute, we get our 200 OK with nothing, which is a lot nicer than when we do our get search and we put, oops, we have too many parameters here. So if we say something like metadata here and ID is not used, we'll fix that. Then down here, we see we got server response 200 OK. Did we end up putting that in two places? Or did it figure out because it was metadata? Oh, because we used metadata. Yep. But let's fix that here where we did get type search. We should not have the ID, and make sure that we cleaned up all of these while we were copy pasting so that the parameters match what's in the route. Good enough. Perfect. So now if we go check that we fixed all those things, and we bring our window here, delete some of the old ones. If we do FHIR get resource name, it can't tell the difference. So if we tell it this is metadata, it'll give us our 200. But if we tell it it's patient and we execute, then it gives us a bad request, which is exactly what we expect because metadata route is an OK, and anything else is going to be caught by the get type search, which is not going to, it's going to return the bad request. So that looks pretty good for the start of an API. We are missing query parameters that we'll start reading in a moment, but we can actually go ahead and, actually looking at the time, I think I might end this video there. And that way we can pick up next time with injecting all of the things so that we can swap in and out the different layers we want and go from there. So as always, please like, subscribe if you like the content. Feedback is always welcome and encouraged. And links for the GitHub repo and everything we did here will be posted with this video. Thanks. Cheers.